Tonight, we explore the hidden story behind African and tribal archetypes, not as distant folklore or exotic belief, but as a shared human memory shaped by night, landscape, and the quiet intelligence of survival. A memory that began long before written language, when the world after sunset felt alive in a different way, attentive rather than empty, and early humans learned slowly and carefully that darkness was not simply the absence of light, but a change in how awareness itself behaved. Because when vision softened, listening deepened, imagination widened, and the mind became more sensitive to movement, sound, and silence. And it was within this altered state that the earliest archetypes took form, not invented deliberately but discovered through repeated experience, passed from one generation to the next through story, gesture, and ritual. And as you listen now, perhaps allowing the body to settle and breath to lengthen, you may notice how night still changes perception. How thoughts become less linear and more symbolic, how memory and feeling begin to blend, and this is not accidental. It is ancient, rooted in a nervous system shaped to survive environments where the dark bush, the forest edge, and the unseen were real sources of risk. And so fear emerged not as panic, but as awareness, a quiet alertness that helped early communities endure. And over time, this alertness became meaning, and meaning became myth, giving rise to ideas of living nature. Ancestral presence, invisible forces, and ritual order, not to frighten the mind, but to help it remain oriented when certainty disappeared. And across the African continent, where vast landscapes, dense forests, and powerful animal life shaped daily experience, these archetypes developed with particular clarity, reflecting a deep relationship between human psychology and the natural world. And yet, similar patterns appeared everywhere humans lived close to uncertainty. Among Native American tribes, Polynesian navigators, early Asian communities, all sensing that something in the night required respect rather than confrontation. And this respect did not come from superstition alone, but from observation, from noticing how fear sharpened attention, how ritual calmed the group, how shared symbols reduced chaos by giving the unknown a shape that could be remembered. And as you rest with this idea, you may feel how the mind responds to gentle explanation. How fear softens when it is understood as function rather than flaw, and this understanding is the quiet foundation of tonight's journey, because these archetypes were never meant to keep humanity awake. They were meant to guide it safely into rest, into stillness, into the vulnerable hours when the world could not be controlled. And perhaps this is why so many tribal stories are told slowly, with repetition, allowing the listener to relax into familiarity rather than brace for surprise. And as the narrative unfolds, each symbol will emerge not as a threat, but as a reflection, a mirror of how the subconscious learned to navigate uncertainty long before modern words existed for psychology or neuroscience. And you may find yourself wondering, gently and without urgency, why the idea of the night bush still carries weight, why masks still unsettle, why the thought of ancestors watching can feel comforting rather than frightening, and these questions do not demand answers yet. Because their purpose is not to stimulate the mind, but to let it drift, trusting that meaning arrives naturally when the nervous system feels safe. And safety in these stories was always created through shared understanding, through the sense that fear was not faced alone but held collectively, shaped into ritual, symbol, and memory. And as you continue listening, allowing the edges of thought to soften, it may become clear that what we call archetypes are not relics of a primitive past, but quiet companions still walking beside the modern mind, especially at night when the world grows indistinct and awareness turns inward. And it is here, in this calm threshold between waking and sleep, that the oldest human stories still do their work, not by explaining everything, but by reminding the mind that it has been here before many times and that it knows, deeply and patiently, how to rest. As the mind settles into the rhythm of this shared memory, attention drifts naturally toward one of the oldest and most quietly powerful fears carried by tribal consciousness, the fear of the night bush, a phrase that does not simply describe vegetation or terrain, but an entire psychological boundary where certainty ends and awareness must adapt. Because in many African environments, the bush was not empty land. It was alive with movement, sound, and unseen possibility. A place where predators rested, insects hummed with unseen presence, and paths disappeared without warning. And after sunset, this space changed character completely, becoming less readable to the eye and more demanding of the senses. And early humans learned that survival depended on respecting this shift, not by panicking, but by adjusting behavior, slowing movement, lowering sound, and staying close to one another. And over generations, this practical adaptation became symbolic, encoded into stories that framed the night bush as a place that noticed intention, responded to disturbance, and required restraint. and these stories were not meant to discourage curiosity forever, but to mark a time and condition when exploration carried unnecessary risk. And anthropology shows that similar boundaries appear across the world, in Native American warnings about forests after dark, in Polynesian taboos surrounding certain night journeys, and in Asian traditions that treated wilderness as active rather than passive, all reflecting the same cognitive response to environments that overwhelm prediction, and neuroscience helps explain this response. Noting that when sensory information becomes incomplete, the brain increases threat sensitivity, scanning for pattern and movement more intensely, which can create the feeling that the environment itself is watching. And rather than interpreting this sensation as internal, early cultures externalized it, naming the bush as alert, responsive, and potentially hostile, a framing that encouraged caution without requiring constant conscious reasoning. And as you listen now, perhaps noticing how darkness still changes the feeling of unfamiliar places, you may recognize this ancient response within yourself, how the mind becomes quieter yet more alert, how imagination fills gaps left by sight, and this is not a failure of reason, but a survival feature refined over thousands of years. The myths of the night bush honored this feature, teaching communities when to retreat rather than advance, preserving energy and reducing unnecessary danger, and over time, these teachings became layered with spiritual meaning, as ancestors, spirits, and invisible forces were associated with the bush, not because they lived there literally, but because the bush represented the edge of human control, where outcomes could not be guaranteed, and this symbolism appears again in many cultures, where wilderness becomes the realm of gods, spirits, or trials, reflecting the psychological truth that the unknown demands humility, and as the narrative continues, the night bush becomes less a place and more a state of mind, the moment when awareness recognizes its limits and chooses caution over assertion. And perhaps this reframing allows the fear to soften, revealing itself as intelligence rather than threat, a signal from deep memory reminding the body how to conserve itself. And as the night deepens within this listening space, the bush recedes from danger into symbol, inviting rest by assuring the mind that it does not need to solve or confront what lies beyond its vision, only to remain present, grounded, and still, trusting that survival has always depended not on constant movement, but on knowing when to pause, and this pause, gently practiced now, is one of the oldest human skills, quietly guiding awareness towards sleep. As the sense of the night bush settles into stillness, the narrative widens to reveal the deeper layer beneath it, the ancient survival fear that shaped not only how humans moved through darkness, but how the nervous system itself learned to respond to uncertainty. Because long before fear was named or explained, it existed as a bodily signal, a tightening of attention, a quiet readiness that emerged whenever vulnerability increased, and in early tribal life, this signal was essential, guiding humans away from unnecessary risk and toward collective safety, especially at night, when vision faltered and the margin for error narrowed. And anthropology shows that communities who respected this internal warning survived longer, passing on not just genetic traits, but behavioral memory encoded through story and ritual rather than instruction. And across cultures, similar expressions of this survival fear appear, among Native American tribes who spoke of listening to the land after dawn, among Polynesian navigators who trusted subtle shifts in sound and movement, and among ancient Asian societies that marked night as a time for inward attention rather than outward action, all recognizing that fear, when unhurried, functions as awareness rather than panic. And modern neuroscience confirms this, showing that the brain's threat detection systems evolved not to frighten, but to prepare, increasing sensitivity to subtle cues while slowing impulsive response, a state that feels quiet yet alert. Much like the state you may feel now as the mind drifts toward rest, and myths transformed this physiological state into narrative, giving it shape and meaning so it could be shared without analysis, allowing even children to understand when to be still, when to stay close, and when to wait for light. In this transformation was deeply practical, because abstract explanations were unnecessary. Stories carried instruction more effectively, embedding caution into memory without requiring constant conscious effort. And over time, these stories accumulated symbolic detail, associating fear with spirits, forces, or ancestral presence, not because early humans misunderstood their fear, but because symbolic language allowed complex internal states to be remembered and respected. And as you listen now, perhaps noticing how certain sounds or thoughts briefly heighten awareness before fading, you may recognize this same ancient mechanism at work, a system designed to activate gently and deactivate just as smoothly. and problems arose only when fear remained active without context, a situation more common in modern life where inherited responses are triggered without corresponding environmental threat, and tribal rituals address this imbalance by providing release. Through communal gathering, rhythm, repetition, and rest, allowing the nervous system to complete its cycle and return to calm. And this is why rituals often followed moments of fear or uncertainty, not to suppress it but to close it, to signal safety and continuity. And similar practices appear worldwide in drumming, chanting, storytelling, and shared silence, all functioning as regulatory tools long before psychology named them as such, and as the narrative continues. This understanding reframes fear as a cycle rather than a flaw, something that rises, guides, and resolves when allowed to complete its function. And perhaps this reframing feels comforting, because it suggests that the body knows how to return to rest when given permission. That vigilance does not need to be forced away, only gently acknowledged. And as the night deepens within this listening space, the ancient survival fear that once protected early humans begins to settle again. Recognizing the familiar pattern of safety, repetition, and shared presence, and in this recognition, the mind can release its watchfulness, allowing awareness to soften without losing connection, trusting that the same instincts that once guarded life now understand when it is time to sleep, carrying you gently forward into deeper stillness, where fear no longer needs to speak because it has already been heard. As ancient survival fear completes its quiet cycle and releases its grip, attention turns toward the way early humans perceived the world around them, not as neutral matter, but as something responsive, watchful, and alive, giving rise to the belief that nature itself could feel hostile, not out of malice, but out of unpredictability, because in tribal environments, the land was not a backdrop. It was an active participant in survival, offering food, shelter, and protection, while also concealing danger, disease, and sudden change. And this duality shaped perception deeply, encouraging the mind to treat rivers, forests, storms, and animals as intentional forces rather than passive objects. A perspective known as animism, which modern anthropology recognizes as an early cognitive framework rather than superstition. And across African cultures, this framework allowed communities to remain attentive to subtle environmental signals, listening to wind, movement, and silence as meaningful information, and similar worldviews appeared globally. Among Japanese traditions that honored living landscapes, Native American beliefs that treated land as relational, and Polynesian navigation systems that sensed the ocean as aware rather than inert, all reflecting a psychological truth that when survival depends on interpreting complex environments, the mind benefits from treating nature as communicative, and neuroscience supports this, showing that humans naturally attribute agency to ambiguous stimuli, a trait that enhances learning and prediction under uncertainty. And when the environment feels unpredictable, this agency can feel hostile because the nervous system remains alert to change, interpreting sudden shifts as potential threat. And myths gave language to this experience, framing nature as capable of response, anger, or withdrawal, which encouraged respectful behavior without requiring scientific explanation. And as you rest now, perhaps noticing how weather, sound, or temperature subtly influence mood, you may sense how deeply this perception remains within you, how the body responds to environmental cues before the mind forms interpretation. And this responsiveness is ancient, shaped by generations who learned to survive by attuning themselves to subtle change. And problems arose only when this attentiveness turned into constant vigilance, a state that tribal cultures addressed through ritual, rhythm, and rest, reminding the body when it was safe to relax its watchfulness. And this balance between respect and release is key, because nature was never perceived as hostile at all. Only during moments of imbalance, drought, darkness, or disruption, and myths reflected this nuance, portraying nature as responsive rather than cruel, capable of restoration when approached with care. And this approach fostered psychological resilience, allowing fear to coexist with trust rather than overwhelming it. And as the narrative continues, this understanding prepares the ground for the next layer, where the unseen aspects of nature, forces without form, begin to shape belief. Not because they were imagined arbitrarily, but because invisibility itself became a source of uncertainty that the mind needed to interpret. And this interpretation unfolds gently, as the night continues to deepen and awareness drifts further inward, supported by the quiet knowledge that the world has always felt alive to the human mind, not to frighten it, but to teach it how to listen, and in listening, how to rest. As the living presence of nature becomes familiar rather than overwhelming, attention turns toward what cannot be seen at all. The forces without shape or sound that early humans sensed more than observed, giving rise to the fear of invisible forces. A fear rooted not in imagination alone, but in the brain's response to incomplete information, because when danger cannot be localized, the nervous system remains alert longer, scanning without resolution. And in tribal environments, this uncertainty was common. As illness appeared without visible cause, storms arrived without warning, and sudden silence could signal hidden movement. And rather than dismissing these experiences as random, early cultures gave them form through myth, naming the unseen so that it could be acknowledged, respected, and contained. And across African traditions, invisible forces were not portrayed as chaotic or malicious by default, but as energies that responded to balance and behavior, reinforcing the idea that attentiveness mattered even when cause was unclear. And similar concepts appear worldwide, in Polynesian notions of unseen currents, in Native American understandings of spirit winds, and in East Asian ideas of subtle forces that influence harmony, all reflecting the same psychological impulse to reduce anxiety by structuring the unknown. And neuroscience explains this impulse through predictive processing, showing that the brain prefers even imperfect explanations to uncertainty, because named uncertainty is less stressful than undefined threat, and myths provided these names, transforming diffuse fear into something that could be remembered and managed. And as you rest now, perhaps noticing how unease fades when sensations are acknowledged rather than resisted, you may sense the same mechanism at work, understanding that fear often dissolves when given shape without judgment. And tribal rituals supported this process, creating shared moments where invisible forces were addressed collectively, not to provoke fear, but to reassure the group that the unknown was recognized and respected, allowing vigilance to release. And over time, these practices became rhythmic, predictable, and calming, signaling safety through repetition, much like the steady cadence of breath or the familiar tone of a voice. And as the narrative continues, the invisible becomes less threatening, revealing itself as a mirror of internal sensation rather than an external enemy. And this realization softens awareness, allowing the mind to drift without needing to resolve every uncertainty, trusting that the oldest human stories already knew how to live with what cannot be seen and how to rest within it peacefully. As the fear of invisible forces settles into quiet recognition, attention drifts toward a presence that felt both nearer and more familiar. The ancestral spirits who were believed to move gently between worlds, not as intruders but as extensions of memory. And the psychology behind ancestral spirits emerges from a simple and deeply human reality, that survival depended on remembering those who came before, their mistakes, their wisdom, and their ways of navigating uncertainty. And in many African societies, ancestors were not imagined as distant or abstract, but as ongoing participants in communal life, present in decision-making, ritual, and moral reflection. Because memory itself was survival and forgetting carried risk, and this belief did not require literal visitation to function. It operated symbolically, reinforcing continuity across generations, allowing individuals to feel supported by those whose lives had shaped the present. And anthropology shows that cultures with strong ancestral frameworks maintained social cohesion more effectively, because responsibility extended beyond the self into lineage, reducing impulsive behavior and strengthening collective identity. And neuroscience offers a parallel explanation, showing that humans internalize attachment figures, carrying their voices, values, and expectations forward as internal guides, a process that begins in childhood and continues throughout life. And ancestral spirits can be understood as the collective expression of this process, a shared internalization of guidance shaped into story so it could be honored consciously rather than unconsciously feared. And across cultures, similar figures appear in Roman household spirits, in Chinese ancestral reverence, and in Native American elder memory, all reflecting the same psychological need to anchor identity and continuity. And as you listen now, perhaps noticing how memories of loved ones influence thought and feeling even in their absence, you may sense how presence does not require physical form to be real. And this realization softens the idea of ancestral spirits, transforming them from watchers into companions, not judging but reminding. And this reminder often surfaces at night when external demands fall away and the mind revisits lineage, family, and belonging, and tribal rituals acknowledge this timing, creating calm spaces where remembrance could occur without fear, integrating loss into life through rhythm and repetition. and this integration is essential for rest, because unresolved grief keeps the nervous system alert, while acknowledged memory allows release, and myths of ancestral presence provided language for this acknowledgement, validating the feeling that the dead remain meaningful without implying threat. And as this understanding settles, the fear associated with ancestral spirits dissolves into respect. And respect into familiarity, allowing the mind to relax its vigilance, recognizing that the past does not intrude to disturb rest, but to support it, offering quiet continuity in moments of stillness. And as the night deepens, awareness prepares to explore how memory sometimes feels so vivid that it seems to return physically, giving rise to stories of the dead walking among the living, a phenomenon rooted not in fear alone, but in the powerful intersection of grief, imagination, and the dreaming mind. As ancestral presence becomes familiar rather than unsettling, the boundary between memory and imagination begins to soften. And within this softened space arose the widespread belief that the dead could return, not as threats but as reminders, reflections of how deeply human consciousness holds on to those it has loved and depended upon. And in many African and tribal traditions, the return of the dead was rarely dramatic or violent. It was subtle, appearing through dreams, sensations, or moments of recognition that felt too vivid to dismiss, because grief does not move in straight lines, and the mind, especially at night, continues its relationship with the absent through imagery and emotion. And anthropology shows that societies without rigid separation between waking and dreaming often interpreted these experiences as visitation, not because they lacked reason, but because symbolic interpretation allowed the experience to be integrated rather than suppressed. And similar beliefs appear worldwide, in Egyptian dream visitations, in Mesoamerican ancestor journeys, and in Japanese ancestral festivals, all reflecting the same psychological truth, that memory seeks expression, particularly when consciousness relaxes its boundaries. And neuroscience offers insight here, explaining how during rest and early sleep stages, the brain reactivates emotional memories with heightened vividness, sometimes blending them with sensory imagery, creating experiences that feel external even though they arise internally. And for early humans, this vividness carried meaning, reinforcing social bonds beyond death and reducing the terror of loss by preserving connection. And as you rest now, perhaps noticing how memories surface gently without effort, you may recognize this same process, the mind revisiting what matters when it no longer needs to focus outward. And myths of the returning dead framed this process as continuity rather than intrusion, reassuring the listener that remembrance was natural and safe. And tribal rituals supported this framing by creating designated times for honoring the dead, preventing memory from overwhelming daily life while allowing it to flow freely during protected moments. And this balance is essential, because when memory is denied, it emerges uninvited, often as unease, whereas when it is welcomed symbolically, it settles peacefully. And as the narrative continues, the idea of the dead returning transforms from fear into function, revealing itself as the mind's way of integrating loss without severing identity. And perhaps this reframing allows awareness to soften further, recognizing that the presence felt in quiet moments is not danger, but attachment completing its cycle. And as the night deepens, the boundary between living and remembered presence becomes less rigid, more fluid, allowing the mind to release its vigilance and rest within continuity, trusting that nothing essential is lost, only transformed into memory, dream, and meaning, gently guiding awareness toward deeper stillness. As memory settles into continuity and the boundary between self and symbol grows softer, attention turns toward objects that once transformed identity itself, the masks that felt supernatural not because they concealed the face, but because they altered perception, allowing the wearer and the observer to experience something beyond ordinary individuality. And in many African and tribal cultures, masks were never simple disguises, they were thresholds, carefully crafted forms that shifted posture, voice, and movement, signaling to the nervous system that ordinary rules had paused and symbolic meaning had taken their place. And this transformation was deeply psychological, because when the face changes, the brain recalibrates social expectation, loosening habitual patterns of recognition and opening space for archetype to emerge. And anthropology confirms that masks functioned as social technology, enabling communities to express forces too complex or overwhelming to be carried by a single person, such as fear, authority, grief, or renewal. And similar practices appear worldwide, in Japanese no theater, in Greek ritual drama, and in Native American ceremonies, all recognizing that identity becomes more flexible when the face is abstracted, allowing collective meaning to surface without personal burden, and neuroscience supports this understanding, showing that facial cues are central to social processing, and when those cues are altered, the brain shifts from individual recognition to symbolic interpretation, a state that feels uncanny yet focused, and this shift explains why masks felt powerful, even unsettling, because they disrupted normal perception without threatening harm, placing the mind into a liminal state where imagination and expectation reorganized, and early cultures used this state intentionally, within ritual, to control rather than provoke fear, allowing communities to encounter difficult emotions in contained, predictable ways. And as you rest now, perhaps noticing how symbolic imagery in dreams feels different from waking reality, you may sense how the mind accepts abstraction more readily when relaxed, and masks operated within the same psychological space, bridging waking and dreaming, self and collective. And over time, stories emerged that described masks as inhabited or animated, not because people believed objects were alive in a literal sense, but because the experience of transformation felt real, affecting behavior, emotion, and memory, and myths preserved this understanding, reminding communities that identity could expand safely within ritual boundaries, and this expansion reduced fear by distributing it, allowing no single individual to carry the weight alone. And as the night deepens, the image of the mask becomes less unsettling and more reassuring, a symbol of the mind's ability to step back from itself, to observe without being consumed, and this ability is essential for rest, because sleep itself is a kind of mask, softening identity, loosening roles, and allowing consciousness to drift into symbolic processing. And in recognizing this parallel, the supernatural quality of masks dissolves into function, revealing them as tools that helped humanity learn how to shift states without losing coherence, a skill that the mind still practices each night as awareness fades gently into sleep. As the image of the mask recedes into quiet symbolism, attention drifts toward stories where identity did not merely shift, but crossed into anath, our form entirely, giving rise to the fear behind animal transformation myths, tales found across African and tribal cultures where humans became animals, or animals carried human intention not as fantasy, but as expression of a deep psychological boundary, because in early environments, animals were not distant from human life. They were competitors, teachers, threats, and mirrors, sharing the same terrain and often the same rhythms of night. And survival required an intimate understanding of animal behavior, posture, sound, and movement, so intimate that the line between observer and observed sometimes blurred. And anthropology shows that many tribal societies viewed animals as possessing qualities humans lacked or feared: speed, strength, night vision, silence, making them natural symbols for instincts that felt powerful and uncontrollable. And myths of transformation gave these instincts narrative form, allowing communities to acknowledge the animal within without surrendering to it. And similar stories appear worldwide, in Norse shapeshifting warriors, in Vedic myths of divine animal forms, and in Native American skinwalker tales, all reflecting the same psychological tension between rational identity and instinctual drive. And neuroscience supports this interpretation, noting that the human brain contains ancient limbic systems that govern aggression, fear, and survival behavior, systems that can feel alien when they surface, especially during heightened arousal or altered states like darkness and fatigue. And myths frame these sensations as transformation rather than loss of control, giving them meaning that could be shared and managed. And as you rest now, perhaps noticing how emotions sometimes rise suddenly without clear cause, you may sense how instinct still speaks through the body, and early cultures did not deny this, they symbolized it, teaching when instinct was useful and when it needed containment. And this is why animal transformation myths often included rules, conditions, or consequences, not to frighten, but to mark boundaries, ensuring that instinct served survival rather than chaos. And over time, fear attached itself to these stories when the balance was misunderstood, when animal qualities were framed as corruption rather than capacity, leaving traces of anxiety that surface in modern dreams of pursuit, transformation, or loss of control. And yet when approached calmly, these images soften, revealing themselves as the mind integrating its own depth, reconciling reason with instinct. And as the night deepens, the animal forms fade back into symbol, reminding awareness that it carries many layers, some older than language, all seeking expression without domination. And in this recognition, fear dissolves into understanding, allowing the body to relax its vigilance, trusting that the instincts that once ensured survival now rest quietly beneath conscious thought. no longer needing myth to restrain them, only awareness to acknowledge their presence gently as sleep approaches. As the animal forms settle back into symbol and instinct returns to quiet background awareness, the narrative turns toward the need that helped early humans stabilize themselves amid forces they could not fully control. The subconscious need for totems, objects, animals, or symbols that concentrated meaning into something visible, touchable, and repeatable. Because in environments where uncertainty was constant and danger could not always be predicted, the mind sought anchors. Points of reference that reassured the nervous system that order still existed, and in many African and tribal cultures, totems fulfilled this role not as idols, but as relational symbols, connecting individuals to clan, ancestry, land, and survival strategy, reminding them who they were, where they belonged, and how they were meant to behave. And anthropology shows that totems often represented animals or natural forces admired for qualities essential to survival, such as vigilance, endurance, cooperation, or adaptability, allowing these traits to be internalized through identification rather than instruction. And similar practices appear across cultures, in Polynesian navigation symbols, in Native American clan animals, and in ancient European standards, all reflecting the same psychological mechanism, that identity becomes more stable when it is symbolically reinforced, and neuroscience supports this, showing that symbolic anchors reduce anxiety by providing predictable cues that activate feelings of safety and belonging, especially in uncertain conditions. And when early humans carried or marked totems, they were not invoking magic, they were regulating emotion, reminding the brain of continuity amid change. And as you rest now, perhaps noticing how familiar objects, sounds, or routines bring comfort, you may sense how deeply this mechanism remains within you. How the mind relaxes when it recognizes something known and meaningful. And the myths of totems preserved this understanding, ensuring that fear did not remain diffuse but was grounded into form that could be approached calmly. And over time, these symbols accumulated layers of story, ritual, and reverence, not because the objects themselves held power, but because repetition strengthened association, embedding reassurance into memory. And this reassurance was especially important at night, when external orientation faded and internal symbolism took precedence. And as the night deepens, the image of the totem becomes less about protection from danger and more about protection from disorientation, offering the mind a steady reference point as consciousness loosens its grip. And perhaps this is why modern life still gravitates towards symbols, personal rituals, and meaningful objects, unconsciously recreating the same calming structures in new forms. And as awareness drifts further inward, the need for external anchors begins to soften. Because the mind recognizes that the stability once provided by totems now exists internally, carried forward through memory, habit, and learned safety, allowing fear to release its hold and settle into trust, preparing the way for the next layer of understanding, where repetition itself becomes the tool that turns chaos into calm, and ritual emerges not as superstition, but as rhythm, guiding the nervous system gently toward rest. As symbolic anchors quiet the need for constant orientation, attention turns toward repetition itself. The steady patterns that early humans discovered could calm the nervous system and transform uncertainty into something manageable, giving rise to rituals that controlled chaos not by eliminating danger but by creating predictable structure within it. And in African and tribal societies, ritual was never separate from daily life. It was woven into movement, sound, and timing, shaping how people gathered, prepared, rested, and responded to change. Because repetition reassures the brain that despite uncertainty, some things remain stable, and neuroscience confirms this effect, showing that rhythmic repetition reduces stress responses, synchronizes group emotion, and signals safety to the body, allowing vigilance to release without losing awareness. And anthropology observes that rituals often emerged around moments of vulnerability, nightfall, illness, death, transition, and seasonal change, precisely when fear might otherwise escalate. And by marking these moments with familiar patterns, communities prevented anxiety from spreading uncontrollably, containing it within shared action. And similar practices appear worldwide in Vedic chanting, in Native American drumming, in Polynesian navigation rites, and in ancient European seasonal ceremonies, all reflecting the same psychological insight, that chaos feels less threatening when it is approached together, rhythmically, and without urgency. And as you rest now, perhaps noticing how steady breathing or gentle narration eases the mind, you may sense this same principle at work, repetition guiding awareness away from scattered thought and toward continuity. and myths preserved this wisdom by framing ritual as necessary rather than optional, embedding emotional regulation into culture itself, ensuring that fear did not remain individual and isolating but communal and resolvable, and over time. Rituals became symbolic representations of order, teaching the nervous system when it was safe to relax, and when it was time to remain attentive, and this balance prevented both panic and complacency, supporting resilience across generations. And as the narrative continues, ritual emerges not as control imposed from above, but as cooperation with the mind's natural rhythms, a way of listening to fear without letting it dominate, and perhaps this reframing allows the body to soften further. Recognizing that calm does not require certainty, only pattern, and as the night deepens, awareness begins to feel held by rhythm rather than thought, carried gently toward the quieter layers of consciousness where fear no longer needs explanation, only containment, and this containment, learned long ago through shared ritual, still functions now, guiding the modern mind toward rest through the same ancient pathways of repetition, familiarity, and trust. As rhythm steadies awareness and repetition dissolves urgency, fear completes another quiet transformation, no longer experienced as an immediate sensation, but as shared memory carried collectively rather than individually. Because in tribal societies, fear was never meant to be held alone, it was distributed through story, song, gesture, and ritual, allowing the emotional weight of survival to be spread across the group, reducing its intensity and making it manageable over time. And this collective holding is what allowed fear to become wisdom rather than trauma, encoded not as isolated terror, but as guidance remembered together. And anthropology shows that oral traditions function precisely this way, preserving not just events but emotional responses, teaching future generations how to feel about the night, the bush, the dead, and the unseen without reliving the original danger. And across cultures, similar mechanisms appeared in indigenous American storytelling circles, in Polynesian navigational chants, and in African communal rites, all ensuring that fear remained contextualized, balanced by belonging, and neuroscience supports this process, showing that shared emotional experiences reduce stress responses, synchronizing nervous systems and reinforcing safety through connection. And when fear is shared, the brain interprets it as information rather than threat, allowing regulation rather than escalation, and myths served as vessels for this sharing, carrying ancestral experience forward without overwhelming the listener. And as you rest now, perhaps sensing how listening itself feels calming, how awareness relaxes when it recognizes continuity beyond the self, you may feel this collective memory at work, reminding the mind that it does not need to solve or confront ancient fears alone, because they have already been processed, refined, and softened by countless others before, and this recognition is deeply soothing. Because it reframes fear as inheritance rather than burden, a legacy of attention rather than alarm, and over time, this legacy settled into what Jung described as the collective unconscious, a reservoir of symbolic memory that surfaces in dreams, art, and intuition, offering familiar shapes to experiences that might otherwise feel isolating. And as the night deepens, these shapes no longer demand interpretation, they simply provide reassurance, signaling that the mind is moving along a well-traveled path toward rest, guided by patterns that have always led safely inward. And perhaps this is why certain symbols feel comforting even when their origins are forgotten, because the nervous system remembers their function. And as awareness drifts further, the need to distinguish one myth from another fades, replaced by a sense of continuity, where all stories merge into a single understanding. That fear, when shared and remembered, loses its urgency, becoming quiet knowledge that supports rather than disturbs. And this knowledge settles now, gently and without effort, preparing awareness to release even the idea of fear, allowing it to rest fully within the calm recognition that nothing essential is being carried alone, and that the mind can let go, trusting the deep memory of humanity to hold what no longer needs attention. As collective memory settles into quiet background awareness, the symbols that once guided survival begin to appear differently within the modern mind, not as stories remembered consciously, but as feelings, patterns, and images that surface gently in dreams, art, and moments of unguarded reflection, revealing how tribal fear has never vanished, only changed its language, because the environments that shaped those early archetypes may no longer surround us in the same way. Yet the nervous system that learned from them remains intact, responding to darkness, silence, and uncertainty with the same ancient sensitivity. And in contemporary life, this sensitivity often appears as unease in unfamiliar spaces, comfort in ritualized routine, fascination with masks, animals, and ancestral imagery, and the sense that nature carries presence even when approached through screens or distant memory. And anthropology observes that modern societies continue to recreate tribal patterns unconsciously, through festivals, symbolic clothing, shared music, and collective experiences that echo the same need for rhythm, identity, and emotional regulation. While neuroscience explains that these patterns persist because they are encoded in deep brain structures responsible for threat detection, bonding, and meaning-making, structures that do not disappear simply because technology changes the surface of life. And as you rest now, perhaps noticing how certain images or sounds feel calming without clear reason, you may recognize these inherited responses at work, the mind reaching for familiarity rooted in collective history rather than personal experience. And Jungian psychology described these moments as archetypal activation, when symbols from the collective unconscious surface to guide emotion rather than intellect, especially during rest, when analytical control relaxes. And this is why dreams often borrow tribal imagery, animals, shadows, ancestors, and rituals. Because the dreaming mind speaks the oldest symbolic language available to it, not to frighten but to integrate emotion. And when these images appear without context, they can feel unsettling. Yet when understood as echoes of ancient regulation systems, they soften, revealing their original purpose to reassure the mind that uncertainty is navigable, that fear has been felt before and resolved before. And that rest is possible even when the world feels vast and alive. And as the night deepens, this understanding allows modern anxiety to loosen its grip, recognizing that many fears are not personal failures, but inherited sensitivities awaiting acknowledgement. And perhaps this recognition brings relief, because it shifts the burden from the individual to the collective, from isolation to continuity, and as awareness drifts further inward, the modern mind begins to align once more with the ancient rhythm it never truly lost, where fear rises, guides attention, and then dissolves into calm, leaving behind not tension but wisdom, gently preparing consciousness for the final stages of rest, where symbols no longer need to appear because their work has already been completed. As the modern mind aligns with this ancient rhythm and the symbols that once carried fear begin to rest quietly in the background, a deeper calm reveals itself beneath them. A calm that was always present but often obscured by vigilance, because when fear is understood as regulation rather than threat, its intensity naturally fades, leaving behind a steady awareness that does not demand attention, and this is the calm beneath the symbols. The state tribal cultures return to again and again through ritual, story, and shared stillness, recognizing that fear was a doorway rather than a destination. And across African and tribal traditions, this calm was associated not with absence, but with balance, the moment when night, nature, ancestors, and the unseen no longer pressed against awareness, but settled into mutual recognition. And similar resolutions appear across cultures, in Buddhist equanimity, in Taoist flow, in indigenous concepts of harmony with land, all reflecting the same psychological truth, that the nervous system relaxes not when the world is controlled, but when it is understood as patterned and relational, and neuroscience supports this, showing that anxiety diminishes when uncertainty is framed within predictable narrative, allowing the brain to shift from threat detection to integration. And as you rest now, perhaps sensing how the body responds to reassurance without effort, you may notice how breathing deepens, how thoughts slow, how the edges of awareness soften, and this is not because fear has been defeated, but because it has completed its task. Recognized and released, and tribal myths were designed precisely for this outcome, not to keep fear alive, but to guide it toward resolution, embedding calm into the end of every story, every ritual, every night, and over generations, this resolution became intuitive, passed on not as instruction, but as feeling, a sense that after vigilance comes rest, after darkness comes stillness, and after uncertainty comes trust, and this trust does not require belief in spirits, forces, or symbols. Only acknowledgement of the mind's capacity to regulate itself when given time, rhythm, and shared meaning. And as the narrative nears its close, the calm beneath the symbols becomes more tangible than the symbols themselves, offering a spaciousness where awareness can drift without grasping. And perhaps this is the moment when sleep feels closer, not as something to pursue, but as something already arriving, carried forward by the same ancient intelligence that once taught humanity when to be still, when to listen, and when to let go. And in this letting go, there is nothing left to interpret, nothing left to resolve, only the gentle continuity of breath and the quiet understanding that fear has always known how to step aside when safety is recognized, allowing rest to take its place naturally, without effort or instruction. As the final movement of this long, shared memory unfolds, Everything that once appeared as fear, symbol, or archetype settles gently into its simplest truth, that these stories were never about danger alone, but about teaching the human mind how to remain alive, attentive, and eventually at peace. And in this quiet completion, the African and tribal archetypes explored throughout the night returned to their origin as subtle instructions carried by the body rather than the intellect, reminders of how to listen, how to pause, and how to release control when vigilance is no longer needed. And this release is the deepest inheritance these myths offer, because survival is not only about staying alert, it is also about knowing when it is safe to rest. And across generations, humanity learned this balance through repeated nights, repeated rituals, and repeated stories that always led back to stillness. And modern science now confirms what ancient cultures felt intuitively, that the nervous system heals through rhythm, familiarity, and reassurance, and that sleep is not a loss of awareness, but a reorganization of it, where memory, emotion, and meaning are quietly integrated. And as you rest now, perhaps sensing how the body feels heavier yet calmer, you may recognize this integration happening naturally, without effort, guided by patterns far older than conscious thought. And in this moment, the night bush no longer threatens, the ancestors no longer watch, the masks no longer transform, the animals no longer pursue, and the invisible forces no longer press against awareness, because their work has been completed, their messages received, and their presence folded gently into understanding. And what remains is not emptiness, but continuity, the sense that the mind belongs to a long human story that has always known how to move from fear into rest, from alertness into sleep, and this belonging is profoundly calming, because it removes the burden of vigilance from the individual, placing it within shared memory where it can rest without consequence. And perhaps this is the quiet, universal truth these myths leave behind, that fear was never meant to define humanity, only to guide it until understanding arrived. And when understanding does arrive, fear naturally softens, releasing awareness into trust. And as this final thought settles, there is nothing left to do, nowhere left to go, and no symbol left to interpret. Only the steady rhythm of breath and the gentle certainty that rest has always been part of the design, waiting patiently beneath every story, every night, and every human mind, ready to return whenever it is all load.